had some strange experiences at the crematorium. One of them happened in 2013, after a service for a very heavy man, around 380 pounds. I got the cremation chamber heated up while my wife set up a movie to watch while the man's cremation took place. I used a platform to lift and then slid him inside, closing the chamber door, and then I sat down. About 5 minutes after I closed the door, we heard a thumping sound. We didn't think much of it at first, but then it happened again and again. I got up, worried that the man might have had a pacemaker inside him, although it was unlikely since his organs had been removed. The thumping got faster and more frantic. We looked through the front window of the chamber and couldn't believe what we saw. The man inside was moving around wildly, with both his arms and legs flailing as if he were in great pain. Now, it's normal to see some movement during cremation, because as the body breaks down, the limbs can twitch due to muscle and tendon contractions. But this was very different. The man's fingers were clenched into fists and were hitting the windows, and his legs seemed to be kicking downward, as if he was trying to get out. Then, he opened his mouth, and first, groans came out, followed by screams. There was no way he could have still been alive. Absolutely no way. But for about 20 seconds after we rushed up to the chamber, the man inside continued to scream and thrash his arms and legs. My wife and I stood there, frozen, watching the impossible. The man's movements became more and more violent, until suddenly they stopped altogether. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of life. The man had been burned to ashes before our eyes, but the memory of what we had just witnessed would stay with us forever. We looked at each other, both equally unsure of what to do next. Should we call the authorities? What would we even say? That a man who had already been dead had seemingly come back to life inside the cremation chamber. It sounded insane. In the end, we decided to keep quiet about what had happened. It was too bizarre, too unbelievable. When I was a teenager, my friends and I loved sneaking out of our homes for excitement. One day, my friends Dan and Jimmy came up with the idea to sneak out and explore the local cemetery at night. I was up for it. We sneaked out a little after midnight, making sure our parents were all asleep. The cemetery wasn't too far from our houses, about a half-hour walk. It was a dark night, but the moon was out, so we could see fairly well. We entered through the cemetery gates and started exploring. We joked about seeing ghosts or spirits. As we moved to the back of the cemetery near the deep forest, we read the names on the gravestones. That's when we heard strange noises coming from one of the mausoleums. At first, I thought it was just my imagination due to the late hour, but the noises got louder, like a group of people praying inside. It was a large mausoleum, and it had the name Ravenswood on it. I imagined they were high society folks from the early 1900s. Suddenly, we heard something move in the darkness behind us. I looked, but it was probably just an animal. I was scared, but Dan and Jimmy were laughing and teasing me. Dan wondered why someone would come to pray here so late. I said that maybe people wanted to pray for their loved ones. Who are we to judge? Jimmy dared me to go inside the mausoleum and pay my respects to the dead. I accepted the dare, and as I approached, I felt strangely calm. The murmuring from inside was soothing, like ASMR. It sounded like they were saying my name. I knew I had to go in. Inside, I saw an elderly man and woman kneeling with their backs to me. They had long white hair, and the woman wore a white gown while the man had a suit. I couldn't see their faces or any part of them except for their clothes. They were both swaying back and forth, and I could hear a pleasant murmuring sound coming from them. A small part of me thought that there were too many voices in the murmurs for just two people, but I didn't pay much attention to that. I entered the Ravenswood Mausoleum with the intention of paying my respects. Both of them stopped swaying, but the murmuring continued. I told them I was there, and the man nodded and made a crunching sound. He stood up, and I could see he was shorter than me by about 4 inches. His thin, bony shoulders made it seem like his suit was hanging on a hanger. When he turned toward me, I saw his rotting, skeletal face with a permanent, lipless grin. His eyes were shriveled orbs held in place by cracking eyelids. Suddenly, a part of me knew something was wrong, screamed inside my head. My eyes flew open, and I took a step back, just as the man reached out and grabbed my wrist. It hurt so much that I cried out. I looked at my wrist, and I saw the man's dried, almost gone skin growing back, with muscles and veins appearing on his fingers. Meanwhile, my own hand and wrist started withering away in moments. It was like he was snatching away my body. Panicked, I grabbed his forearm with my other hand. The transformation hadn't reached that far up his arm, so the brittle bones inside his suit sleeve crunched under my grip. A dry scream came from the man as he reached for my neck. I felt his scratchy finger scraping my neck's soft skin, and it tightened as he tried to take my life. I pulled back, yanking on his arm, and the bones in his suit sleeve separated. I stumbled out of the building. Dan and Jimmy thought I was trying to scare them with a dramatic act, but when they saw a figure beside me, they also started screaming and running. The man's right hand was still attached to my arm, but now that it was separated from him, the sickening effect seemed to be mostly reversing itself. While running, I managed to pull the hand off with some effort and tossed it to the ground. We ran back to my house, and while I escaped with my life, I still bear marks on my wrist and neck from that night. I vowed never to visit the cemetery again, not for fun and not at any time of day. My name is Michael, and this happened on a cold and windy night in November. I live in a somewhat big and old town with buildings from the 18th century. My friend John and I were feeling bored one night, so we decided to go out for some fun. It was around 2 a.m., which isn't the smartest time to go out, but we wanted to enjoy ourselves. We got tired of driving around and playing our loud metal music. At that time, we both had our own band. So, we thought it might be interesting and cool to take a walk in the town's cemetery. Behind the old town square, there's a huge cemetery that covers about 20 acres of land. It's really enormous. We decided to explore the older part of the cemetery, which was separated from the newer section by an old iron fence and gate. We started walking around, checking out the old graves covered in moss, taking pictures, and I admit being a bit disrespectful. But these graves were from over a century ago, and there was no one alive to be upset about it. We figured the people in the graves wouldn't mind too much. We had passed by about 10 or 15 gravestones when John suddenly stopped in his tracks. He motioned for me to wait. I couldn't see much in the dark, but in the distance, I could barely make out a figure standing next to one of the gravestones. As we got closer, both John and I felt uncertain about what to do, so we just stood there. We thought we had been caught by one of the graveyard caretakers and were worried we might get in trouble. The man stopped a few feet away from us, still too far for us to see him clearly. He asked, "What are you two doing here?" John nervously explained that we were just exploring. "Well, I'm going to have to show you two out," he said. He instructed Yus to follow him and started walking back in the direction he had come from. Both of Yus were beginning to regret not running away when we first saw him. As we followed him, he passed under one of the street lamps, and John and I froze in shock. The man was wearing tattered clothes, nothing like what a graveyard keeper would wear. He looked more like a homeless person. The man must have heard us stop, and when he turned around, we could see that he had a crazy look in his eyes. He took a step toward us and angrily said, "Come here." Without thinking, John and I turned and ran as fast as we could. The man's footsteps were right behind me, and it felt like he might tackle me at any moment. Adrenaline kept us going, and we managed to jump over the fence. We heard the man stop on the other side and punch the wooden fence in frustration. We didn't tell anyone about this except our friends because we knew what we were doing was against the law. Both of us believed that the man was probably homeless and might have been trying to rob us or do something even worse. Thankfully, we never made the mistake of going back to that cemetery again.